Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining me as we do a survey of Etruscan art. We'll start with a general overview of who the Etruscans were and what we know about them, before turning to look at the tombs, art, and architecture, and the traditions that they left behind. So who were the Etruscans? Well, they were a people indigenous to the Italian peninsula, and their culture dominated the northern and central regions for several hundred years, from about 900 BC to 282 BC. At that point, the final independent Etruscan city-states were annexed into the Roman Republic. Now, even then, however, it seems like there was a distinct cultural identity that was Etruscan within Roman civilization that persisted for several hundred more years. The Etruscans, we know, had extensive contact with the Celts and the Germanic tribes to the north, and with the Greeks and other Mediterranean peoples. And their location between these two groups brought them a great deal of wealth and power through trade. The Etruscans also occupied an area that was very rich in metal ores, which they mined, exported, and also worked. They were known throughout the ancient world for producing very high-quality metalware, like this magnificent bronze that you see here on the left. Now, one of the tricky things when talking about the Etruscans is the fact that they were very similar both ethnically and culturally to their Latin neighbors. Early Rome was a monarchy, and the names that we have of the kings are actually Etruscan. And during the Roman Republic, Etruscans who moved into Roman territory were granted full citizenship. Although Rome did annex Etruscan territory militarily ultimately, the Etruscans were really not so much conquered as they were assimilated over time. And given this close and really foundational relationship between Rome and the Etruscans, it's honestly surprising that we don't know more about them. So just as an example, we can read some Etruscan and have some understanding of its mechanics, but we don't know the meaning of many, probably even most of the words. We know that they adapted a variation of the Greek alphabet for their writing, but Etruscan itself is a non-Indo-European language. That is, it probably originated independently in Europe during the Neolithic. It's not related to any other languages, really. The other example of this type of language, and the only one that still exists to this day, is actually Basque. Basque is not related to any other language that we can determine. And we're told by ancient accounts that the Etruscans had a really thriving literary culture, but we only have a few surviving texts that are more than just a few lines long. Roman and Greek writers end up being one of our main sources of information on the Etruscans, but they honestly got a lot of things wrong, and they were writing from a particular perspective as well. Now, several authors do tell us, and it seems likely, that during the 6th and 5th centuries, there was a federation of 12 Etruscan cities called the Etruscan League. The Etruscans were totally independent city-states rather than a unified kingdom or nation. And in addition to Roman and Greek authors, our main source of information on the Etruscans is their tombs, and it's with these tombs that we'll start today. The modern city of Trivhetri was called Carrhae by the Romans, and it had an absolutely massive necropolis. Today it's called the Banditaccia necropolis. And the necropolis at Banditaccia was used from the 9th through the 1st centuries BC, so about 900 years, a very long time. The bedrock in this whole area is a form of sedimented volcanic ash called tuff. It's very soft and easy to carve, and Banditaccia, the tombs there are carved out of the native rock, so they're partially carved into the earth and then partially built up using blocks that are cut from the tuff. The larger, more expensive tombs, like you see here, are in great circular mounds called tumuli. And depending on the size of the tumulus, there can be multiple tombs inside, like the overview or bird's eye view cross-section that you see on the left. Some of the tombs are really quite simple chambers that are accessed by a short corridor, like you see here, just arranged side by side like houses on a street. And in fact, Banditaccia is organized much like a city, with streets and houses for the dead arranged along it. Now, the very earliest burials at Banditaccia, however, have cremated remains put in ceramic urns that are buried in a small pit like you see here. Many of these urns look like small houses, as on the right. Now, this is useful to us because we can assume that this is similar to what Etruscan houses of the time would have looked like, with cross beams, thatched roofs, and a rounded structure probably made of daub or mud and straw combination. Over time, though, we see the tombs becoming increasingly large, more elaborate, displaying greater wealth. And these tombs would have been used for entire families, with each body being laid out on a slab. This is one of the earlier tombs at Bandatatia. Now, keep in mind that the whole thing would have been painted quite brightly, as we'll see in some of the other tombs later today, and the roundels on the wall would have been painted to look like shields, thus its name, the Tomb of the Shields and Chairs. Notice the appearance of this tomb interior. So we have chairs, we have rafters, we have lintels and beams around the door, we have beds or couches, but all of this is carved out of the rock, right? So none of it is structurally necessary. These rafters, so-called, are merely the appearance of rafters. In fact, the whole tomb is laid out and sculpted to imitate an Etruscan house. So just as the deceased were put in house urns in the earlier period, the tombs for the dead are made to imitate houses for the living on the inside. We can really see this in what's called the Tomb of the Reliefs. Now, sometimes in art history, we talk about tombs or objects, rather, that are just really good examples, that they're really good types of something. And then there are other things that we talk about because they're so unusual. They're considered masterpieces or just really more remarkable. And this tomb is of the second kind. We don't have any other tomb that is like this at all. So it's very unusual. But as you'll see, the tomb plan, as you can see on the left, is really quite simple. Okay, so the top view shows you the cross section, the sort of elevation. It's accessed by a stairway that then goes into this one single room. And the whole tomb was made to accommodate of 32 bodies. It's very simple in its layout, but that's really the only simple thing about it. The walls and the pillars are covered with painted stucco objects that look like they're hanging up. So there are drinking vessels, a rope, shields, water pitcher. There are even animals here. There are niches, as you see, cut into the walls and decorated to look like beds, complete with pillows. Some of the bodies would have been placed in these niches, and then others laid below in these kind of slots. You can see there's a little bit of a ridge bordering each spot where a body would be laid to rest. The niche at the back in the center of this picture is double the depth of the others, so a married couple, would have been laid to rest side by side in it. And as we'll see, the married couple seems to have been a really important social unit within Etruscan society. This is the most important, most extensively decorated niche, indicating both the importance of this couple within the family and the centrality of their role within the tomb. So you can see here that the stucco beneath it is worked to resemble a bed, and then beneath the bed is Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the gates of the underworld in Greek mythology. There are many other Greek influences here as well, like the drinking cups, and the bed itself are also in Greek style. Now, there was a lot of contact between the Etruscans and Greeks. After the Greek Dark Ages, which you may remember from a previous talk, the population began to increase as Greek civilization recovered, and many Greek cities sent out people to settle in other parts of the Mediterranean because they were simply not able to support a large population. Many settled in the south of Italy, and they brought with them Greek culture and also established a trading port. Now, some of these colonies were totally independent of their mother colony. They were politically independent, and others were trading ports so that they were still governed by the home colony or home city. It just depended. Now, the Etruscans were crazy about Greek culture. Their economy was robust enough that it could support a market for imported luxury products like Greek vases, like we see here. In fact, what's really interesting is that most of the really excellent and well-preserved Greek vases that we have today actually come from Etruscan tombs, not from sites in Greece. So in Greece, pots would be used until they were broken, right? But for the Etruscans, these were prized collector's items that would have been entombed with their owners. It's kind of like the difference between wearing your Nikes and putting them on a shelf in a case. We also see the different stylistic of phases of Greek art showing up in Etruscan art, as the trends in Greece are spread to Italy and picked up on by the Etruscans. But it's important to note that they're still modified or selectively adopted according to the Etruscan tastes and priorities. So this is not simply a rote copying. We have a good example of this in the famous sarcophagus of the spouses. Now, like most Etruscan sculpture, this is made from terracotta, so a type of fired clay, not from stone or marble. It would have been made and fired in 4 parts and then fitted together for use. You can see that there's a seam running down the middle to join the 2 halves, and then there is a lid and that consists of the couple themselves, and then the lower portion is the bed. Now, this is a double sarcophagus, and it would have contained the bodies of the husband and wife, who are represented on the lid of the sarcophagus. But notice the way in which these figures are represented. Their features are very simple, very generic. The heads and torsos are nice and voluminous. There's a sense of roundness and spaciousness to them, although the man's shoulders and chest are still quite blocky. But in the back view especially, you can see that naturalism, that is a sense of how things actually appear in nature, is instead replaced with a real love of patterns and symmetry, especially in the way the man's hair is arranged. You can see that it's in even sort of bumps signaling either curls or braids, and then arranged in a fan across his back so that each of the braids are evenly distributed. You can see this in the woman's hair in front as well. There's still a sense of liveliness and energy to the figure's upper bodies, though. It's their lower bodies that are a total afterthought, and you can especially see this in the photo on the right. It's like their legs are kind of deflated underneath the blanket that they share, and you'll notice that the way that the man's body is unnaturally elongated and stretched to make his feet come to the same length as his wife's. So this kind of focus on the upper body at the expense of the lower body is characteristic of Etruscan sculpture at this time. But if we compare the face of the woman with an archaic Greek sculpture from the same period, we notice that there's a really strong similarity here. In both cases, we have these sort of schematized features that are very simple. The almond eyes, the arched brows, and you'll notice a very slight smile that is actually so common in archaic sculpture that it's called the archaic smile, and it's meant to just lend this sense of lifelikeness to the figure. You'll notice that there's even a similarity in the braids or the hair as it falls across the chest in these 2 sets of 3 on the peplos core, and then 2 sets of 2 on the sarcophagus. Now, if the couple's features didn't make it clear that these figures are not actually portraits, they're quite generic, right? We can confirm this by the presence of another almost identical sarcophagus. So these were both found at Banditacia and were made around the same time. They're both terracotta. They're both called the sarcophagus of the spouses, so it makes it a little confusing sometimes. The best way to identify them is by their current location. One is in the National Etruscan Museum in Rome, and the other is located in the Louvre in Paris. Now, the almost identical nature of these sarcophagi, the fact that they're produced at the same time and in the same place, tells us that it's almost certain that they were made by the same workshop. And this is interesting because not only does it tell us that there were workshops of people making terracotta sarcophagi, it also tells us that people could go and ask for or order these types that were kind of pre-made almost. They were pre-established that people would go and pick out and order for themselves or for their loved ones. It also tells us that there was not a massive emphasis at this time on individuality in depictions of human beings. It was more important in this case, apparently, to have this kind of idealized, very Greek style. Now, you may have noticed the way that the hands are posed, as if they're supposed to be holding something. And the right hands are both rather open. The man's especially on the left is flat. Excuse me, the left hands are both open. The right hands are seem to be holding something, but the left hands are flat. He was probably holding a dish like this that was used in to make offerings, or a kylix, a type of goblet used for parties and drinking wine. She may have been holding a perfume bottle, which is something that we see on other sarcophagi as well. But as for the right hands, to figure out what was in them, we have to turn to a different necropolis near the Etruscan city of Tarquinia. And here we have a banqueter reclining on a dining couch, as was the fashion from Greece, and as we saw in the sarcophagus. And in his right hand, he's holding this white, oval-shaped object. This is, in fact, an egg. Decorated eggs, like the stone one that we have on the left, are found in Etruscan tombs, as are the shells from real eggs. Eggs show up again in a different tomb 40 years later, again being held up prominently by a male banqueter, this time reclining with his wife. You can see the different in sex indicated by the different color and skin. And again, an egg in this tomb that's about 150 years later. We see the husband either giving or receiving an egg from his wife. So why this proliferation of eggs? Well, it's probably for the same reason that they're often used in Easter celebrations today, as a symbol of new life and regeneration. Now, this is really interesting, because to have a symbol of life emerging from something that appears to be dead, to have it set in a tomb suggests that there may have been a sense of an afterlife in the Etruscan culture. The sense that after the body dies, there's an element of the self that survives beyond death. In fact, Etruscan tombs seem to be much more about celebrating life than they are about mourning or death. The most common fresco subject by far is banquets and parties. There are dancers, musicians everywhere, and this emphatic focus on life and community and joy is really quite different from the impression that we get from Egyptian tomb paintings, for example, which are very formal, very ritualized, and very solemn. They're also very different from Greek funerary images at the same time that are also very solemn and unemotional. And there's another major difference between the Etruscan images and their Greek sources of inspiration, excuse me. So the way in which the figures are dining by reclining on couches is very, very Greek. We have lots of images of this in Greek art. But the inclusion of women in this setting is totally Etruscan. Not only are women included here, but they're actually presented on equal terms with the men as peers. They get equal attention both visually and narratively in these spaces. The Etruscan artists may have gotten their visual inspiration from Greek sources like these vase paintings, but these are scenes of symposia they're banquets with lots of drinking that were strictly open to men. They were really just like all-night drinking parties in which they started out, theoretically talking about philosophy and such, and it probably kind of devolved as the night went on. The women at symposia, however, were, if there were any, educated courtesans called hetairae, like we see in the image on the right here. The prominence of women in Etruscan art is therefore totally un-Greek. And it also lines up with the status of women in later Roman culture, where women could get divorced, inherit and own property, run businesses, go out in public rather than being restricted to the home like Greek women were. And one of the most interesting tombs at Tarquinia is this one, called the Tomb of the Shields. It was a tomb of the Velka family, and in the main room you'll notice, again, It has the imitation rafters and beam, paintings covering the walls. It would have been, if you can imagine it in its prime, quite colorful with this red base and then this pattern of waves separating the lower red portion from the frescoes above. What's really cool about this tomb is that the frescoes depict the couples who were entombed here. So we have the names and the office or title held by the husband. And another sign of the woman's comparatively high status is the fact that her maiden name is given, not just her first name. Okay, so this couple, for example, is identified as Velther Velka and Ravnu Apurthnai. I have no idea if that's pronounced correctly, and frankly, no one else does either. We don't really know for sure how to pronounce Etruscan, and they like to mush together a lot of different consonants without indicating the vowels that go with them. Now, their sarcophagus would have most likely been placed under the painting, so they have the sarcophagus below containing the bodies or their cremated remains, and then the fresco above documenting their names and their status in life and commemorating their status as a married couple. Again, a really central unit in Etruscan culture. The main room is covered in paintings, but the adjoining room, which you can see through the doorway here, is really comparatively plain. And many more bodies would have been placed in these spaces. Now, this is really interesting because it suggests that the audience for these paintings was the living, not the deceased. So this is really unlike the paintings in Egyptian tombs, for example, where they were covered with imagery and writing, but they were sealed up. So the audience was not the living, but the dead, but the spirit. The Egyptian tomb paintings are functional. They're meant to help the deceased reach the afterlife successfully. Etruscan tombs, by contrast, may have been places where relatives would come and perform offerings or other rituals to honor their ancestors. They may have even had banquets within the central room of the tombs. And so tombs like this created a sense of family identity and continuity, legacy. If you can imagine, again, coming into this space and seeing your ancestors represented here on the walls and their bodies set out below, you have a very visual, very tangible image of your own lineage and your own place within your family history and your society's history. And again, this is something that was a core value of Roman culture, and we'll talk about that in next month's lecture more. But I want to point out this fresco near the door to the adjoining room. It's not in very good shape, even after a recent restoration, but we can make out that there's a winged figure wearing this robe-like garment and then a belt or harness that crosses over the chest. And this figure is called a vanth. We find vanths throughout Etruscan imagery, in funerary imagery specifically, in frescoes, on sarcophagi, on vases. She's identified by her wings, a short dress or robe with the crossed straps. Sometimes she's bare-breasted, sometimes she's not. She has short fur-lined boots, and then she carries a torch with her. It's not clear whether vanth is the name of a single deity or if it's the name of a category, of a type of spirit, as if there are multiple vanths. But regardless, she appears as a guardian and a guide for the dead, someone who, as you can see in this lower center image, is putting her hand on the shoulder of the deceased as they say goodbye to their living relatives. She's often paired with this guy named Charon. Now, the name Charon is very similar to this figure in Greek mythology, Charon, who ferries the souls of the dead across the river Styx into the underworld. But it seems like the Etruscan Charon existed before there was much Greek influence, and so it seems like maybe he existed as a character or a figure in Etruscan culture, and then as the Greek influence came in, the Greek name of a similar figure in their culture got applied to the Etruscan character. Now, unlike the Vanth, Charon, you can see, is a very frightening figure. He usually has lots of wild animal-like hair, a large hooked nose, large animal ears, often donkey ears. He has blue skin, and sometimes is wrapped up in snakes. His trademark accessory is a large hammer. Now, despite his appearance, Charon does not seem to be a negative figure. He does not seem to be an adversary or an antagonist. He's paired with Vanth not as an enemy, but as another element in the passage from life to death. So, total guess, but it may be that Charon is responsible for the soul's actual departure from the body, or for maintaining the barrier between life and death, and the Vanth leads the spirit on to the land of the dead, but that's just a guess. They seem to be working together, however. And when they show up in tombs, the pair are usually placed on either side of a doorway, as if protecting the threshold. Now, this makes sense. Thresholds are kind of dangerous places, right? You can have bad things come in, you want to keep good things in and not have them lead. And so, it seems like a logical place to put kind of protective symbols around, right? But what's especially interesting is that the door itself isn't always real. So here in these pictures that I'm showing you, these are not physical doors. This is a solid rock wall that has a door painted on it. So it's not an actual opening, at least not one that can be used by physical living beings, but perhaps one that is accessible to spirits. And here is a particularly interesting fresco with the pair. We can recognize Charon with his blue skin and hammer, and the Vanth with her open wings. But these thoroughly Etruscan entities are in a scene from the Trojan War, so a Greek story. So the Vanth here has been taken out of her usual short dress and boots, and is here wearing a robe appropriate to a Greek goddess or Greek woman. In the center, the Greek hero Achilles is in a fury after the death of his friend and lover Patroclus, and so he's taking it out on the enemies who have been taken prisoner. Achilles grabs a Trojan captive by the hair with one hand and slits his throat with the sword in the other, and then to the right is another Greek warrior looking on in a very lovely classical pose, contrapposto, and then tied up on the right is another captive, perhaps the next to be executed in Achilles' wrath. Now, the quality of this fresco is absolutely exquisite. The painter was probably Greek, or at least trained in Greece, and clearly extremely skilled. The two men on the right are especially well done. But what's also really, really cool is that we have basically the Etruscan retelling of a Greek story. So this is an episode from an epic that is at the very core of Greek identity, and is being imagined through an Etruscan spiritual lens to include Charon and Vanth, because Achilles is killing these prisoners. Logically, to the Etruscans, Vanth and Charon must also be present in the setting. And Vanth, you might notice, has her wings on the one side sheltering Achilles, and on the other sheltering this figure who has a blue robe. This is the shade, or the ghost, of Patroclus. So here she seems to be here in order to shepherd perhaps the deceased prisoner into the afterlife, but also as a guardian, as an accompaniment to Patroclus, who is looking on to the scene. Now, the Etruscans were what we today call eminent polytheists. That is, they believed in and worshipped hundreds of different major and minor deities who they believed were present and active in every single aspect of daily life and existence. Everything had this inherent spirit that needed to be either propitiated or controlled somehow. And this is something that we find in Roman culture also. And the image I'm showing you here is of a shrine, to household gods from a Roman home in Pompeii. Now, each home would have something like this where the family's protectors would be honored. So to the Etruscans and to the Romans, the world was this really complex web of subtle powers and supernatural agents. Everything had this own kind of spirit or animating energy to it. And one of my favorite of these minor deities is the god of the door hinge. We're not talking about a god like Zeus or Mars that has like a personality and looks human and has all these bizarre adventures or misadventures. We're talking about an animating spirit, right? An energy that's attached to this object and that can protect the house. So if you want your home to be protected, to keep bad things out, good things in, especially the door hinge god was associated with protecting children who would be, living in the home, of course, and not going out quite as much as their adult counterparts. It was very important that the god of the door hinge be given some food or oil as a little bit of an offering to keep it in a good mood, to make sure that it does good things for you. It keeps working as it should, and it keeps protecting you and your family. We do know that the Etruscans adopted many of the gods from the Greek pantheon, like Apollo, whom we see here in a terracotta sculpture from a temple at Portonaccio. The Etruscans named him Aplu. Now, we don't have this temple anymore. We know it was made of wood, and then terracotta sculptures were placed on the top. So terracotta, unlike marble, is extremely light. So whereas the Greek sculptures could only be placed in the under the eaves and the pediment of the temple or attached to its sides, on Etruscan temples they would put their sculptures, their statues on top, as you see in the model here. So this figure of Apollo, or Aplu rather, on the right would have been one of these figures sitting on top of the temple. You'll notice that he has this archaic smile. He has this extremely patterned, very artificial drapery, this accordion-like fold that goes down one side. This is characteristic, again, of the archaic period, of the archaic style, like we found in the sarcophagus of the spouses that we looked at earlier. So in many ways, again, it's similar to Greek art, but it also has a great deal more energy, more animation, more sort of life to it than we find in Greek sculptures of the period. Later on, we have this sculpture, again, a terracotta, this time from a sanctuary at Pyrgi, near Cervetri, near the Banditaccia necropolis that we looked at earlier. We think that this is the head belonging to a goddess or deity named Catha or Leucothea. We are not entirely sure who she is. She seems to be either a moon goddess or associated with the sun or with the afterlife. We're not really sure, but we know she was worshipped in one of the temples at Pyrgi. And you can see that this head that we have remaining of her sculpture is full of life. This is really a far cry from the artificiality that we had in the archaic period. There's wind moving in her hair that is just really animated and full of life and vibrant. She's turning her head, her eyes are moving. It helps that we have some remains of pigment on the sculpture. Remember that all ancient sculptures would have been originally painted. We sometimes forget to mention that and to emphasize it. But you can see here the remains of red pigment in her hair, her eyebrows, her lips, her lashes, and marking the pupils of her eyes. So there's this really intensely beautiful, vibrant energy here. This is characteristic, again, of the Hellenistic period. You can see this on the left on a Hellenistic Greek sculpture. This one is a copy, a Hellenistic copy of a original that was produced by the artist Lysippus, and it's depicting Alexander the Great. Now, we see this similar kind of pose, this turning to look, this tilt of the head, turning of the neck. The eyes seem to be engaged, looking at something. The hair is a little bit more animated, more naturalistic. The lips are slightly parted to suggest motion or breath. And there's not this self-conscious kind of smile like we had in the archaic period. Nonetheless, there's a great deal more energy here in the head of Catha than there is in the head of Alexander. Partially, this is because of the material. You're able to create a lot more animation and vibrancy in a material like terracotta because of the technical properties of it. It's able to be molded and shaped. It's a lot lighter, so it can make shapes that are not sustainable for marble, which is quite heavy and brittle. But it's also a characteristic of Etruscan art as a whole that there's this greater emphasis on energy, on lifelikeness, on vibrancy that we saw even in the tomb paintings as well. This emphasis seems to be really characteristic of Etruscan art in general, whether it's taking place in the frescoes of tombs or in the sculptures of gods and goddesses used at temples. Now, the Etruscan religion was really much more focused on what we might call practical religion than on the kind of formal worship that we see with the Greeks and Egyptians. The Etruscans had a whole series of texts about how to interpret even the most mundane events in nature, like the directions that the birds are flying in, and in which section of the sky they are, and how many birds there are, and what kind, and does one fall while, or what happens when they're flying, and on and on and on. It all had meaning. And these texts that tell how to interpret these signs are referred to by Roman authors as the Disciplina Etrusca. And they were said to have been revealed to the Etruscans by this mysterious child prophet called Tagus that just emerged out of the tilled soil one day. And then this seer, or sibyl, named Vigoya. Now, those who could read the signs were highly educated and specially trained in this area, and they're called haruspecs. And we see a small bronze of a haruspex here on the left. He's recognizable, especially through his characteristic little pointed hat that looks like the tip of a crayon. And we know that there was actually a college of 60 haruspecs at Tarquinia. So it was a particular class or group of people, and this was probably passed on through families. Etruscans were especially fond of mirrors, and since they had lots of raw materials and skilled metal workers, they were able to produce for themselves and for export abroad many, many, many mirrors. And the backs were usually decorated with incised scenes from stories or mythology or everyday life. So this mirror shows a figure who is conveniently labeled as Calchas. And we know Calchas from the Iliad. He is a seer or a prophet in Greek mythology. But he's a human, and here, however, he's being presented in this Etruscan mirror with wings. So it seems to suggest that perhaps he's being transformed into a sort of semi-divine figure, given these attributes. He is holding something in his hand and looking over it, and that object is a sheep's liver. We actually have this model of bronze model of a sheep's liver that was found at a place called Piacenza. And you'll notice that there's writing all over it, with the areas sectioned off by lines. And here, for comparison, on the top right is a diagram of the parts of a ruminant liver. You can see that the model has much more exaggerated shapes, probably to accommodate more writing and fit more text onto it. And this is really a kind of cheat sheet for how a haruspex could read the liver of a sacrificed animal and interpret the future or messages from the spirit world using the different lumps and bumps and coloration of the liver. So we don't know exactly how this works, and we don't know what a lot of the writing on the bronze actually means, but we do know that one of the sections has Catha's name on it. And so perhaps if there's something going on in that section of the liver, you make it a sacrifice to Catha, or there's another one that says Tinia, which is the Etruscan name for Zeus. And so again, perhaps he somehow ruled over this zone. So you can also see, let me get my pen here, boop, boop, doop, laser pointer, all right, right up here, on the top of the pyramid shape here, there's this hole. It's pierced so that it could be worn on a string around the neck, so that you are never without your handy dandy sheep's liver, because you just never know when you're going to need to interpret liver. All right. Now we're going to finish up today with this bronze statue of a man named Aule Metale. It's also called the Orator, or in Italian, the wonderful word arringatore. And he's named this because of this gesture of the raised hand tells us that he's addressing a crowd. It's a standard symbol or gesture in Roman art that we see when people address troops or give lectures or political speeches and such. The sculpture itself is really very exciting because, for one thing, it's really rare to find large bronze sculptures like this. This is life-size. And especially to find them in such good quality. There are a few missing patches in the back, some damage. This is a hollow piece. It's made from probably lost wax casting, which is a technique that the Etruscans used. And so this is not a solid piece of metal. It's like a shell, essentially. Now, sometimes little bronzes might be passed over through the centuries and survive to this day and not get recycled, but for a big life-size piece like this to make it is really unusual. Metal is quite valuable. It's a lot easier to melt it down into something else than it is to mine it and process it from scratch. And so almost all of the large-scale bronzes that existed in antiquity were recycled into later sculptures. Now, this figure is shown wearing a Roman toga, so a formal garment that was worn by citizens and sort of like a three-piece suit, honestly. This is something that was very nice. Like in cartoons and popular culture, we think of Romans wearing togas all the time, and that's not true. If you think about this, a toga is a really, really long stretch of fabric that's wrapped in a special way. And you have to weave this fabric by hand. There are no machines to do this. And if you look at your shirt or your bed sheets or something, and think about all of the rows of thread, all of the individual pieces of thread that make that thing up, someone had to, in the ancient world, do that by hand. And so to have a length of fabric like this, that's a sign of extreme wealth and prestige. And so it's a sign of honor to the office that the wearer holds. And so you did not just go out and muck the stables wearing your toga. This was a formal official garment, essentially. He's also has his hair cut short in what is the very Roman style. And we know that his shoes even are a type of sandal that is called the calceus senatorius, that were worn by senators and senior magistrates in the Roman government. And there's a lot of attention to his face, a lot of care taken to replicate the specific features of this man. This is not a generic, standardized type like we saw with the sarcophagus of the spouses, okay? This is clearly a portrait. We have the sense that having seen this sculpture, we could then recognize the man himself. Incidentally, there would have been shell or stone and glass eyes set in there, so they wouldn't just have been hollow sockets. It would actually have been a very visually arresting impression of having someone actually look at you. So we can recognize that there's an individual here. His nose, his chin, the lines and creases in his face all have this uniqueness to it. And we'll talk about this next time, how accurate and even exaggeratedly realistic portraits were in the Roman Republic and how important that was. But in fact, this whole statue is really a portrait of the ideal Roman citizen, someone who is honest and humble, which we can tell through his willingness to be depicted in this way with all these imperfections. He's someone who participates in the Roman government, someone who's a senator, a leader who is engaged in the public forum, actively participating in society, and indicated by his oratory pose, speaking and taking a stand. Oratory was a value or a skill that was extremely highly valued by the Romans. Now, Cortona, where this sculpture was made, was an Etruscan city. that was part of the Roman Republic by this time, and it's assumed that this portrait sculpture was created by an Etruscan workshop. And we look down at the hem of the toga, we find an inscription. This inscription is written in Etruscan, which is read from right to left. And it reads something like this. Either to or from Aule Metale, the son of Vel and Vesi, Tanine set up this statue as a votive offering to Sans by deliberation of the people. So this tells us a lot. First of all, we know this guy's name, Aule Metale. We know that the statue was somewhere public, either at a temple or in the city, but not in a home. It may have been an offering made to a deity, or it could have been a way of honoring Aule Metale himself. We also know the names of Aule Metale's parents, Vel and Vesi. We don't know if Tanine is someone who had the statue erected, or if that's the last name of Vel and Vesi. We also don't know who Sans is, presumably, some kind of deity. But what's interesting is that Aule Metale's parents have Etruscan names. So this is a Roman portrait of a Roman senator of Etruscan birth and lineage that is made by Etruscan metal workers, and it seems dedicated to an Etruscan god. Sorry, that's where you see his name, Aule Metale, there. So this statue then is really the perfect emblem of how the Etruscan people, the Etruscan civilization came to an end. Not just by disappearing or being wiped out, but by forming a new civilization with the other Italic tribes, a civilization that would soon be the largest empire in the world, and one in which the Etruscans would continue to have a distinct identity and role for hundreds of years.